Next up, we have Dr. Patricia DeMarco, and she's a senior scholar at Chatham University. Patty?
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's so good to be here and see all of you today. I am delighted and honored to be among you, among such august company. I really miss being in research after hearing so many of you doing things that are really important and on the cutting edge. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about the genetically modified organisms that are so much part of our commercial crop production. We have been, as humans, gatherers and have moved from those who are gathering from the land to farming and selective breeding by selecting what you want to have more of through the principles of inheritance. You just choose what you like and you make sure those are the ones that you gather the seeds from, and you cross-pollinate in order to get refined and more productive agricultural products. It has happened thus from the beginning of the time that we began to cultivate crops and stay in one place instead of migrate around. And cultivating varieties with different traits by sequentially selecting hybrids and cross-fertilizing among the same species has been a very productive and useful way of improving the nutrition and the productivity of what we grow. But in about the 1970s, 1973, recombinant DNA came available, and we began to have the capacity technologically to modify crops so we could combine traits across species, even across phyla, by inserting a little piece of DNA into the target plant or animal in some cases, and grow it in tissue culture so that you could produce crops that had seeds with that new trait. And this is a genetically modified organism that is not available from just cross-selecting by natural processes. And it's had a number of applications. One of the earliest ones was to make human insulin using a bacterial medium so that you wouldn't have to use extracting insulin from animals and then hoping that it worked as well in humans. It was a huge breakthrough. Another one was creating edible vaccines for diseases like hepatitis, HIV, and malaria. Another great medical advance. And biosynthesis in this way has made advances in availability and cost reduction for important pharmaceutical elements. Also, it has been used in bioremediation. When you make genetically modified bacteria that now have the capacity to break down pollution that includes mercury and persistent organic pollutants, and clean up oil spills. You will deploy a bactericidal group that comes in, and the bacteria eat up the spill, and then they go away and you have no problems. It also has been used in agriculture, and in this area it has been attacking pest management and nutritional enhancement. And there have been some really significant papers done in this, which I hope you have a chance to look at. The United States is the leading user of genetically modified organisms in crops. Close to 90% of our major commercial crops, canola, corn, cotton, and soy, are based on genetically modified organisms. And they're modified to be Roundup Ready because you can control weeds by spraying the fields, and the weeds just don't grow, and hopefully your crops still do fine. And there are some arguments for using GMOs in agriculture. They enhance the food quality. You can have enhanced agricultural productivity in terms of the yield per acre because no weeds grow. And it can enhance nutrition by putting things like vitamin A and protein enhancement into normal crops. And you can create drug factories for creating edible vaccines and pharmaceuticals. And they claim to reduce the agricultural footprint by reducing the fossil fuel use in agriculture because you don't have to use a lot of extra equipment for weeding and tilling and harvesting, and it conserves water. And the industry claims that it uses less pesticide. I do contest that, and the arguments against GMO are heavy in not so much that the technology itself is a problem, but the way we apply the technology has been put forward in a manner that is contaminating massive amounts of farmland. The effects are often untested for generations. We don't know the long-term impact on dispersion of genetically modified seeds into non-genetically modified populations, and they can escape and transfer into wild populations without really having a good idea of what that impact will be. And it has a tremendous effect on the loss of biodiversity and habitat destruction in farm areas. It's especially concerning that there is an increased use of chemicals in agriculture in a manner that the pesticides and herbicides persist in the harvested foods. And there's a possible transfer to other organisms, for example, bacteria in your own biome, in your gut. This is requiring a great deal more study, and early reports are not uniform. But there has been good documentation of super weeds. The plants that are affected by this develop resistance themselves in 2 to 3 years sometimes. And so you have to have GMO modified crops that have multiple resistances to herbicides and pesticides together. And then in 2 or 3 years, you find things like the pigweed amaranth that is resistant to everything they can throw at it and is really even difficult to hack out of the fields. It's becoming a major problem. And this is the kind of thing that is the unanticipated consequence of using Roundup Ready crops. It also does, in fact, increase the pesticide use. Monsanto introduced Roundup Ready crops in 1995, and you can see the rapid escalation of the pesticide and herbicide use in all of the crops that are affected since that time. And this is a U.S. Geological Survey study where they survey the groundwater and the land over time, and periodically every 2 years they do a national survey. And so this data is publicly available and well documented. The ecological effects are also especially concerning because pollinators, animal pollinators, are really important for our production of food crops. 75% of our food crops depend on animal pollinations, like honeybees, moths, other kinds of domestic bees, even small birds. And nearly 90% of the flowering plants are also dependent on wild pollinators. Herbicide spraying, especially aerial spraying, reduces and destroys non-crop producing plants that are the habitat for the pollinators. And the pollinators are found to be very susceptible to some of the toxic pesticides that are employed, especially neonicotinoids, which are systemic pesticides, and their sublethal and indirect effects on the pollinators are very poorly understood, and they're not real easy to associate with each other. You don't usually account for those in the risk assessments that are made for pesticides and herbicides. The risk assessment is based on whether they're harmful to people, but the habitat destruction doesn't count. However, it has a huge potential economic impact. They contribute about $29 billion to farm income, and this is one of those ecosystem services that we don't count in the cost of our production system. We don't count in the cost of the gross domestic product. So losing pollinators is a huge potential loss. And the other problem that's coming up is things like Roundup, and there are a number of pesticides. I don't have a lot of time to go into all of them. I chose glyphosate because they're finding residues in finished foods. Again, the Environmental Working Group did a small pilot study. They tested 45 of 47 samples, and they found higher than safe levels of glyphosate in off-the-shelf products. So, of course, the FDA had to go do a huge study in order to prove them wrong, and lo and behold, they found that the safe levels were exceeded, 5.0 parts per million being the considered safe level, and they found an average of 6.5 parts per million in corn in particular. So these kinds of studies are alarming because many of these pesticides and herbicides have endocrine disrupting properties as well, as you've heard earlier today and from a number of other speakers. So your concern is they use glyphosate sometimes to spray on crops to dry them so that they can all be harvested at the same degree of ripeness instead of having some green and some dry. They dry the crops out by spraying herbicide on it right before they harvest. So there isn't even time for the glyphosate to be washed off. It's harvested with the grain and ends up, in the finished product, which is a huge concern. And the EPA has just reauthorized it for another 5 years because they found no meaningful risks to human health when the product is used according to the pesticide label. They did find in their own study that there is a potential for effects on birds, mammals, and terrestrial and aquatic plants. Since when aren't we mammals, right? So this is the kind of thing that I find extremely concerning, in that the regulatory process is not protecting the public interest in how our foods are produced. And we are putting massive amounts of chemicals onto the ground across the country in producing commercial crops using genetically modified organisms that are designed to resist herbicides and pesticides for the convenience of the growers. And there are a lot of concerns for effects on the health of workers in particular. You have numerous negative health effects associated with chemical pesticides beyond the endocrine disruption, but dermatological, gastrointestinal, and neurological, carcinogenic, respiratory, reproductive, as well as endocrine effects have been well documented, especially in workers where they're often sent into fields before even 24 hours have passed so that they're exposed. Things like strawberry harvesting or beans where you are close in contact with the crop. And a lot of these materials bioaccumulate in fat tissue so that you have a likely concentration of exposure, not just the relatively small amounts that are applied in diffused form. And this is really an ethical dilemma, not just a technology problem. It isn't that you have technology to be abated and say we ban GMOs, but rather we look at how are we applying this technology in a way that it can be used for beneficial purposes without abusing the broadcast distribution of poisons into the biosphere with no control. We're doing massive experiments on ourselves and there's no control. And you have to look at the whole business of who gets to decide. Without being consulted, we're being exposed to things. You don't even know that you're exposed to them, and we are suffering the consequences for generations. And the ecosystem services like pollination, like soil fertility, and photosynthesis itself are things that the earth gives us for free that we basically do not protect with precaution and concern, and looking forward to anticipating the unintended consequences is something that we should have learned a lesson about long before now. And that cost, those consequences, are going to be paid forward to the next generation and the generation after that. So I like to remember Rachel Carson's message to all of us that we are not alone on this world. We are part of an interconnected web of life, and we are one of the species that inhabit this earth that are completely dependent on all of the other living things that we share the planet with. And if we don't care for them, especially in the broad-scale production of food, in a way that encourages the regeneration of the soil rather than the destruction of its fertility, then we will pay the consequences of that. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.